Student Hippie Anti-War Movement by Jeremy Arevalo and Brady Pierck.
Students against Vietnam. During the 1960s, many students began their protest out of sheer fear and being drafted into the military during the Vietnam War. The anti-war movement was made up of a number of various independent interests, many united only in contradistinction of the Vietnam War. The bombings of North Vietnam under the U.S. government's orders is what led to the attraction of students in protesting on campuses. People from all over the nation were joining into the protest, even people who resided in middle-class suburbs, labor unions, and government institutions. The movement gained national eminence in 1965 and reached its peak in 1968. Their main complaints revolved around political, racial, and cultural issues. Movement leaders mostly made of students expanded methods of protest and even gained new allies over 2 years. Vietnam Day held at Berkeley College in October 1965 drew thousands of students to debate the morality of the war, which led even more views and rallies to promote the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement gained immense power between 1969 and 1973 by having huge rallies, protests, and debated government regulations/actions. The counterculture movement was very against violence and followed the anti-war movement, but many of the people that weren't involved in the counterculture disapproved of their methods to protest, even though they were both against the escalation in U.S. involvement in Vietnam because of the economic costs.
Music changes the game. Folk singers are well aware of the destruction within as well as without of the country during the 1960s. Folk singers like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez wrote about what was going on during the Vietnam War. Bob Dylan's The Lonesome Death of Hattie was about the civil rights struggle during the 1960s. Joan Baez's Birmingham Sunday also captured how hard it was for blacks during the 1960s. As you see, there wasn't just a war in Vietnam in our own country as well. They used their lyrics to reach a more broad audience. It was a way to get people to really listen without anything but vocals and backup instruments. A song that is said to have captured the emotions during the era is Blown in the Wind by Bob Dylan. Another artist that had an influence in this time was Joe McDonald with I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die. In 1965, the war escalated as the U.S. got more involved in the Vietnam War. The whole folk movement went into a new direction. Famous artists and rock stars got more involved in protests and even had guest appearances at anti-war rallies. Thus began the counterculture movement.
When the U.S. sent over more troops to fight in Vietnam is when the counterculture movement arose. People involved in the counterculture movement were completely against the U.S. government's extensive military involvement in the Vietnam. As the 1960s progressed, conflicts sprang in American society, such as race relations, sexual mores, women's rights, traditional modes of authority, experimentation with psychedelic drugs, and materialistic misunderstanding of the American dream. Moving ahead, hippies were what you would categorize any of these counterculture advocates. As the younger generation felt a need to distance themselves from current political involvement, communes were formed to stay on the outskirts of a society and only to be involved with people like them. As the counterculture movement moved on in the 1970s, mainstream would later then devour their influences and impact philosophy, morality, music, art, lifestyles, and fashion.
Anti-war poetry. White bright frame. We all lived in a white frame, a space between time. What we died for was more than just our time. Our combat was never too bright, for who was at our left and right.
The impact that the counterculture has in the world now is it just has different styles, such as these in the picture.
The hippie student rallies with the most impact. Well, there was one at Kent State University campus on Saturday, May 2nd, and they were protesting the anti-war movement, and the National Guard was sent to Kent State University to break it up because they were causing a distraction, and the ROTC building, and it was pretty hectic. And that was only one of various rallies during that era.
How the concert Woodstock was assembled. It was just assembled by four guys named John Roberts, Joel Rosenman, Artie Cornfield, and Mike Lang. They only projected 200,000 people, or 50,000 people, but that turned into 200,000 people, which turned into 500,000 on the day of. And it was very busy, and a lot of things went wrong, but it didn't make a lot of money. But it was considered all one big mess.
Anti-war art. This picture is illustrating that people that aren't involved in political issues lose so much from the economic cost of war. And the other one is that peace is way better on earth than war, and even though war takes up most of our interest in government.
Here's our bibliography, and that's the end.